Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. There you go. So, welcome back. Glad to have you back. We're going to get it started. We're running a little behind time, and in deference to folks' schedules, we'll get this thing going. To remind you, I'm Lex McMillan, and I've played a small role in some of the planning and organizing of this. It's been a joy to do so. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and those of you who've been through the whole thing. How many of you have been here since the beginning? Yeah, good. I mean, on this weekend. Yeah. How many of you have been here on a previous event? Yeah, so we've got some real stalwarts here, so that's good. Clearly a great turnout this morning on a beautiful day, so thank you for being here. I want to say thanks to Linda Dieter, who's provided professional support for this. Well deserved. And her able assistant, Bill, self-described. I also have your husband, so they're partners in crime, but I think Linda was lead on this, so thank you to the Dieters and Dieter Incorporated for that. And I also want to say thanks to Paul Briggs and everybody here at the church who has been so hospitable, and obviously the hardworking planning committee, the visioning committee, and the able leadership of, Roger Clark. I have a friend named Paul Clark. I keep wanting to call you Paul. Roger Clark. Yeah. So all the hard work has been for this. And many others. And many others. Yeah, I know it was definitely a team effort, and a lot of great thought and effort has gone into it from soup to nuts. So gratitude for all that. And then one last little housekeeping, and that is you see these nice little potted flowers on the table. We would like someone to take them with you. And so the principle I've always used in such situations is among you at the table, you can decide if anybody wants it. And then if there's any contest, if there's more wants than flowers, it goes to those whose birthday is closest to today. You can work that out among yourselves. Okay, so that's the lottery system. If there's more than two people who want flowers, then you can work it out by birthdays. All right? So without further ado, I did a really a full introduction of our distinguished speaker and guest, Michael Ward, Dr. Michael Ward, yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat that other than to say thanks again, Michael, for your presence. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good morning. I'm amplified, am I? That right? Good. Well, what is a Christian to make of pain, suffering, and grief? A nice, happy subject for this sunny spring morning. I'm going to narrow it down. I'm going to interpret this title to read, what did one particular Christian make of pain, suffering, and grief? And that particular Christian is C.S. Lewis, who's been our focus of interest this weekend. If you were at my talk yesterday, you will remember how I was talking about the Narnia Chronicles, Lewis's best-known works, and how I believe that the Narnia Chronicles were intentionally, deliberately, but secretly constructed by C.S. Lewis out of the imagery of the seven heavens, the seven planets of the medieval cosmos, which he knew all about as a medieval expert. Here are the seven heavens: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are the seven planets that were known about in the Middle Ages before the invention of the telescope. So there's no Uranus, there's no Neptune, there's no Pluto. The Sun and the Moon are still regarded as planets at this stage of scientific development. And these planets went round the Earth, it was thought, and shed influences upon people and events and even the metals in Earth's crust. And if you went up through the seventh heaven, through the heaven of Saturn, you would eventually emerge out of the created order altogether and emerge into the home of God. This is a slightly more detailed diagram of that old cosmological arrangement as it was believed to be. You see there, Habitaculum Dei, the home of God. Eventually you would emerge out of creation into the uncreated home of God. And although this now seems rather old-fashioned and curious. How did people ever believe that the universe was like this? And although we have discarded it in pretty much every respect as an understanding of our universe, nonetheless, in one respect, we are referring to it every day of our lives, because, of course, it's from these seven heavens that we take the names of the days of the week. Have you ever thought why today is called Sunday? Or why yesterday was called Saturday? Or why tomorrow will be called Moon Day? These names are taken from the seven heavens. And each planet began to be associated over time, over the generations, with particular qualities and attributes. And here's a nice illustration depicting the seven planetary characters in the order of the days of the week. So there we have the sun for Sunday in his burning fiery chariot. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Saturday, Saturn with his sickle was associated with death and disaster, with pain, suffering and grief. So it's Saturn, the seventh of the seven planetary characters, that I want to focus on today. And C.S. Lewis's own interactions with Saturn, symbolically speaking, spiritually speaking, he once said that the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn, we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter? Jupiter was the best planet, Saturn was the worst planet. Lewis says, of Saturn we know more than enough, because Lewis's generation was the generation that went through the First World War. 750,000 British servicemen were killed during the Great War. Lewis himself was nearly one of them. I'll talk about that in a moment. And the seven heavens, the seven planets, were so especially worthwhile in his own generation, he thought, because they reminded people that Saturn was not the only way of interpreting reality. There were 6 other ways, 6 other lenses, 6 other symbols that you could use to interpret reality. But we're talking about Saturn today. Here is Saturn. You can just about make out Saturn with the naked eye. It's very dim, very distant, very slow-moving, but people have known about it since, well, time immemorial, as we will discuss. And slowly, over time, Saturn became associated with these negative qualities. Why is it so distant? Why is it so dim? Why is it so slow-moving? Well, perhaps it's carrying a heavy burden. Perhaps it's old. Perhaps it's ill. These qualities of the planets were not just attached to them arbitrarily, they were imaginative responses to what could actually be seen in the sky. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote a long poem about the planets, and these are the lines that he wrote about Saturn. Up far beyond Jupiter goes Saturn, silent in the 7th region, the skirts of the sky. Scant grows the light, sickly, uncertain, the sun's finger daunted with darkness. Distance hurts us, in the vault severe of vast silence, where fancy fails us, and fair language, and love leaves us, and light fails us, and Mars fails us, and the mirth of Jove is as tin tinkling. In tattered garment, weak with winters, he walks forever a weary way, wide round the heaven, stooped and stumbling, the staff groping, the lord of lead. He is the last planet, old and ugly, his eye father's pale pestilence, pain of envy, remorse and murder. Melancholy drink, for bane or blessing of bitter wisdom he pours for his people, a perilous draught that the lip loves not. We leave all things to reach the rim of the round welkin, heaven's heritage, high and lonely. So those are some poetic insights, as it were, into the Saturnine spirit, the Saturnine symbol. Now let me very quickly trot through C.S. Lewis's early life, just to remind ourselves of how very Saturnine Lewis's first 20 years of life were. Here he is as a young man, 19 years old. birthday that Lewis arrived in the French trenches during the Great War. But before he signed up for war service, he'd already experienced two other major blows, two other major periods of suffering in his life. His mother had died when Lewis was only 9 years old. And then within a matter of weeks of her death, Lewis was sent away from home in Belfast, Northern Ireland, over to England to be educated in England. It's almost astonishing to me now that his father could have taken that decision to uproot this newly bereaved son of his and send him across the sea to England to be educated. That would have been bad enough even if the school chosen had been the best school in the world. Unfortunately, it was probably the worst school in the world. The headmaster of that school was later certified insane and died in a lunatic asylum. He flogged the boys mercilessly and taught them nothing except how to remain solid against the tyrannical oppression of this headmaster. Lewis eventually managed to escape from that school. He begged his father to release him, and he went and was tutored privately for several years. But anyway, his mother died. He had this horrible schooling experience, and then at 19 he enters the British Army. He's given a commission as a second lieutenant. This is the only photograph of Lewis in uniform. In the Somerset Light Infantry, here he is in close-up, and he served for about 6 months before a shell fell in his trench in the spring of 1918. It obliterated the man next to him. Lewis himself was spattered full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around for much of the rest of his life. And he had an out-of-body experience. He looked down on himself from a great height, he said, and the thought occurred to him, here is a picture of a man dying. He thought he was dying. And he did indeed come this close to death. He was very fortunate to survive. One of his close friends did not survive. This is Lewis on the left, and the friend here on the right is a man called Paddy Moore. And Lewis and Moore got to know each other during their officers' training corps training sessions, simply because of the alphabetical arrangement of the billet. Lewis and Moore, L and M, were put in the same room. That's why they got to be friends. And Moore, Paddy Moore, was unfortunately killed. But Paddy's mother and sister, who had got to know C.S. Lewis, took Lewis in as a kind of surrogate son, a kind of replacement for Paddy. And Mrs. Moore, the mother, became a kind of replacement mother for C.S. Lewis. He'd lost his own mother, as I said, when he was 9. So for the rest of Mrs. Moore's life, for the next 30-odd years, Lewis lived with this woman, Mrs. Moore, Jane Moore her name was, and her daughter, Maureen. There was no father on the scene, he'd left the family. So it was a highly unusual arrangement, but I mention it because Mrs. Moore was never reconciled to the loss of her son. Paddy, was her only son, her firstborn child, and she, by all accounts, was increasingly eaten up with bitterness and loss and grief as her life went on. So Lewis had an opportunity at very close quarters to examine what unresolved grief can do to a person. That, I think, is one of the reasons why it features so strongly in his work as a writer. We've talked about some of the poetic symbolism, some of the literary symbolism of Saturn. Let me give you a few images to feast on, or not, as the case may be. Some of these are rather horrible, but Saturn is a horrible subject. Here is a picture by Goya of Saturn, and he's eating there a baby. He's eating a child. This is another image showing the same kind of thing. This is Saturn depicted above the stage at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. All 7 planetary gods and goddesses are depicted above the stage there. And again, you see Saturn is there holding a baby, not because he's going to kiss it, he's going to eat it. Because Saturn is time. Saturn is Father Time. And remember, time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all his sons away.
Is his leg, is it amputated because of how slowly he moves across the sky?
Well, yeah, he's amputated there, and he's old, and he's half naked, and he's aged because, well, he's got all these negative qualities of disaster and pestilence. Who knows why he lost his leg? It could have been gout, it could have been shot off in the war, who knows? Here's a slightly less terrible image of Saturn. Do we have any cricketers in the audience? If anybody knows their cricket, the home of cricket, Lord's Cricket Ground in London, has this weather vane above the stadium. It's the most famous weather vane in England. But interestingly, it shows Father Time with his scythe and his hourglass setting out the wicket. How long is your innings going to be before you are bowled? Someone once jokingly said about cricket, because you know cricket can go on for 5 days and result in a draw. The English are such godless people that they invented cricket to give themselves an idea of eternity. Anyway, that's a very brief thumbnail sketch of some of Lewis's own interactions with pain and suffering in his early life. And the First World War was such a huge trauma for everybody that in the 1920s and 30s, Lewis would say that much of the culture, much of the sort of spirit of the age was not only saturnine, but saturnocentric. People become fixated upon saturnine qualities of death and loss and cynicism and pessimism. You know, much of the movement in art, modernist art, brutality and nihilism and absurdism, was the direct fruit of the First World War. Lewis said this in one of his literary critical essays: "Born under Saturn, we do well to confess the liking complexionally forced upon us, but not to attempt that wisdom which dominates the stars is pusillanimous, and to set up our limitation as a norm, to believe against all experience in a saturnocentric universe, is folly." Now this is a rather dense quotation. Let's just go through it slowly. Born under Saturn. So Lewis is saying that his generation was effectively born under this negative influence, this evil planet. Lewis wasn't literally a believer in astrology. He's talking here symbolically, poetically. But he is admitting that his generation was deeply, deeply unfortunate. They lived in a bad time. They were born under Saturn. And born under Saturn, he says, we do well to confess the liking complexionally forced upon us. Now, it was thought in the Middle Ages that the planet you were born under would show itself in your features, in your complexion. So if you were born under Jupiter, you'd have a bread face. You'd be rubicund. You would be jolly and mirthful. You'd be jovial. If you're born under Saturn, your complexion would be, as it were, leaden. You would be pallid. You'd be doughy and greasy. All unlovely features would show themselves in your face, so to speak. So if you're born under Saturn, you might as well admit it. That's what he's saying. We do well to confess the liking, the inclination, the Saturnine inclination, complexionally forced upon us. We might as well confess that this is our fate, as it were. This is the period we have to live through. But not to attempt that wisdom which dominates the stars is pusillanimous, is cowardly. Now, the wisdom which dominates the stars, in Lewis's view, and indeed in the view of the Middle Ages, was not the Saturnine power, but the jovial power, because Jupiter was the best planet. Who does not need to be reminded of Jove from Jupiter, from that early quotation? So it's cowardly to say, oh yeah, well, we're born under Saturn, there's nothing we can do. We've just got to suck it up. We've just got to muddle through. No. You can do more than that. You can do better than that. You can attempt that wisdom which dominates the stars. You can attempt to get beyond your horoscope, so to speak. You may have been dealt a bad hand, yeah, but you can play it very well if you Submit yourself to the wisdom which dominates the stars, the Jovian wisdom, the better wisdom. To believe against all experience in a Saturnocentric universe is folly. The universe is not fixated, it's not focused on Saturn. Saturn is not the best or the only way of interpreting reality. That's a foolish way of reading your fate. And indeed, it doesn't even make sense logically to assume that Saturn can be the focus of everything. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But anyway, this is a very interesting quotation, I think, for Lewis's sort of admission of the Saturnine influence on his generation, but also his assertion that you can get beyond your bad horoscope. Now here's a question, suitable for a Sunday morning. Can anyone tell me where Saturn is mentioned in the Bible? Do we have any scripture scholars here? I wouldn't claim to be a scripture scholar myself. But once I got interested in Lewis and the planets, obviously I began looking for wherever they appear in the Bible. And Saturn is actually mentioned twice. Once in the book of Amos, the prophet Amos in the Old Testament, and that very verse from Amos is quoted, or at least alluded to strongly, in the book of Acts. You carried the tent of your king, and Saturn, Chiron, as he was known to the ancient Hebrews, your star god, idols you made for yourselves. Now, we don't have time to go into what Amos is talking about here. It's just sufficient for us to note that there was in ancient Israel the possibility of bowing down before Saturn. Indeed, bowing down before any of the planets would be a bad idea, because that would be idolatry. But bowing down before Saturn would be particularly bad, because he's the worst of the lot. So just bear that in mind as a nice interesting little biblical tidbit. Why is it illogical to bow down before Saturn? Why is it illogical to think that Saturn rules the roost, as it were? Well, because we all think that pain and suffering ought not to be happening. We all rail against our griefs and our sorrows. Whoops. We think that the universe should not be like this when we suffer and see other people suffer, especially the innocent suffering. We want to say, no, it shouldn't be like this. But where have we got this idea that it shouldn't be like this? Where have we begun to assume that things ought to be right and proper and happy and good? It's only because we fundamentally believe, actually, that the universe is good that we object to the badness that we see. We all instinctively realize that, no, Jupiter is, symbolically speaking, the center of the universe. Jupiter, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He is the root and foundation of our moral sense, and that's why we object to anything that goes against that. But if everything was just bleak and meaningless and random, why would we assume that our sense of goodness and rightness had any claim for superiority? Wouldn't make sense. And Lewis homes in on this logical point in many places, but one particular place that's very interesting, the way he puts it, is his essay on futility, De Futilitate, where he's talking about the good atheist who says, no, the universe must be better than what we see. If mercy and justice were really only private whims of this atheist's own, with no objective and impersonal roots, and if the atheist realized this, he couldn't go on being indignant. The fact that the atheist arraigns heaven itself for disregarding mercy and justice means that at some level of his mind, he knows they are enthroned in a higher heaven still. There must be a higher heaven than Saturn. Now note that Saturn was the seventh of the seven heavens. It was the last of the planets. But you can actually go beyond Saturn, symbolically speaking, in the medieval cosmos. You can go through the sphere of the fixed stars and into the home of God, as I was saying. There is a higher heaven than Saturn. Saturn is not the be-all and end-all. Let's just remind ourselves of that cosmological arrangement. You can get into the home of God if you keep going up. I think it was Churchill who said, when you're going through hell, keep going. When you're going through hell, keep going. Don't stop. If you keep going, you might come out the other side. If you keep going through the sphere of Saturn, you will emerge into the home of God. You mustn't assume that Saturn rules the roost. You mustn't assume that the universe is finally and absolutely Saturn-centric. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity in the old version. There's plenty of realization, acknowledgement of weakness and absurdity in the scriptures. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, or does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, but time and chance happen to them all. However much we want to avoid suffering, we will get some of it sooner or later, almost certainly. And the scriptures, giving a true account of human life, acknowledge this. They don't pretend otherwise. However, by the time of the New Testament, by the time of Christ, the teaching of the Bible does subtly shift. Jesus himself says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And in the final book of the Bible, we are told, "Blessed are those who die in the Lord." Now there is a truth to the belief that God will bless us with the good things of this life if we are obedient, if we are followers of His, if we grow up to be sons and daughters of God. We will receive many blessings. That is true. But it is not true that we will necessarily escape suffering altogether, however innocent we live our lives. And we know that because of Jesus' own example. Jesus was the sinless one who suffered more than any of us. So suffering is not necessarily connected with sin or immorality. It may be, but not always, by any means. And it's very interesting that this verse, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The cry from the cross, which Jesus uttered as he died, according to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. He was taking here the cry of the psalmist from Psalm 22 onto his lips. It's very interesting that this cry of dereliction is uttered by the one who had no need, no cause of his own to be abandoned, forsaken, deserted by God, and yet he felt it. And C.S. Lewis was fascinated by this verse. This verse, I think, is the one scriptural verse that appears in Lewis's writing more than any other, by quite a large margin. I've counted over 20 occurrences of it in his writings, and it's all over his work, in his fiction, in his apologetics, in his letters, even in his literary criticism, and some of these references occurred even before he became a Christian. He was fascinated by this verse, because it speaks to the deep mystery of suffering and sin, that even the sinless one can feel forsaken by God. So it's perhaps not a surprise that Lewis's first venture into apologetics was the problem of pain. He published this in 1940. It was part of a series of books on Christian themes, and Lewis actually asked if he could write it anonymously, because he said, "I'm going to have to make statements of such apparent fortitude in this book that they would appear ridiculous if anybody knew that it was I who was making them." because he's going to propound a Christian account of suffering, but he knows all too well that he himself finds it, as difficult as any of us to live up to and to cope with real pain. It's one thing to address the intellectual problem, it's another to cope with it in real life. The epigraph to the problem of pain is taken from Lewis's master, George MacDonald. The Son of God suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings might be like his. So that's the key note, I think, of the problem of pain. We don't have time to go into that particular book any further, but I just mentioned that as an important milestone in Lewis's public interactions with Saturn in the course of his career as a writer. The other most notable, most obvious interaction that he had as a writer with suffering, with Saturn, was one of his last books, A Grief Observed, which did appear anonymously under the pseudonym N.W. Clark. Only after Lewis's death was A Grief Observed published by C.S. Lewis. The executors of his estate decided that the book ought to be known as a work by C.S. Lewis. But ironically, just as he had felt inadequate to the defense of Christian teaching on suffering and the problem of pain, and wanted to publish that book anonymously, here where he's wrestling with all the subjective and personal difficulties of suffering, again he publishes it anonymously. The depth of his grappling with the subject, the deep darkness that he goes through in the course of this book, is again almost more than he wants to admit to in public. So he hides behind the nom de plume. And even in private correspondence, he sometimes he signed himself as N.W. Clark to those readers who had written in thanking the publisher for A Grief Observed. And he deliberately hid his own style in A Grief Observed, so that people wouldn't pick up on the fact that it was he who was the writer. And some of his friends, or some of his acquaintances at any rate, sent him copies of A Grief Observed. So read this book, it will help you with your bereavement. So, what's all this got to do with Narnia? Narnia is where we came in, and Narnia is almost where we will go out. We will, if I've got time, end with Lewis's last book, his book on prayer. But first of all, let's explore the last battle, which I believe is Lewis's Saturn story. All the characters who are alive at the start of this story are dead by the end of it. And who is it who brings Narnia to an end in this book but Father Time? Here's a statue of Father Time. Again, you see his scythe and his hourglass. His Saturn is Father Time. And as I was doing my work on the Narnia Chronicles, Walter Hooper kindly alerted me to a page of a typescript when Lewis had been drafting the Narnia Chronicles. When he first mentions this character, which is actually not in the last battle but in the Silver Chair, we see in Silver Chair this character asleep in the underground cavern. And we're told that he will wake on the day that the world ends. So Lewis there is setting up the final apocalypse several books earlier. Father Time doesn't do anything in the Silver Chair, we just introduced him as a character asleep. But in the Silver Chair, in the typescript of the Silver Chair, Lewis had written this. We don't need to read the whole of this page, but filling the whole length of the underground cavern lay an enormous man fast asleep. He was far bigger than any of the giants, and his face was not like a giant's, but noble and beautiful. His breast rose and fell gently under the snowy beard which covered him to the waist. A pure silver light, no one saw where it came from, rested upon him. "Who's that?" asked Puddleglum, and it was so long since anyone had spoken that Jill wondered how he had the nerve. "That is the god Saturn, who once was a king in Overland," said the warden. "Now he has sunk down into the deep realm and lies dreaming of all the things that are done in the upper world. Many sink down and few return to the sunlit lands. They say he will wake at the end of the world." So this, if you like, is a smoking gun, showing us that Lewis did indeed mean to equate Saturn and Father Time, if there was any doubt. There shouldn't be, because he makes the equation absolutely explicit in the discarded image. But here we have a manuscript, a typescript piece of evidence confirming that. But when he came to publish the Silver Share and later the Last Battle, rather than calling this character the god Saturn, he hid his identity a bit more carefully by calling him Father Time, banking on us not knowing that Father Time and Saturn are the same character, but they are. So it's Saturn who brings Narnia to an end in the Last Battle. And in a sense, we ought to have picked up on this from the Last Battle itself, because right in the first moments of the story, we're told that there have been in the night sky over Narnia for many months the most disastrous conjunctions of the planets. Runewit, the centaur, is the stargazer, and he comes and informs the king, Tyrion, and the unicorn Jewel that Aslan has not come back to Narnia, as some people are falsely claiming. If Aslan were really coming back to Narnia, Runewit says, all the most noble stars would be assembled in his honour. But no, the conjunctions of the planets are disastrous. And that very word, disaster, is significant. Disaster. Aster, astronomy, asteroid. A disaster is literally a bad star. These are disastrous conjunctions. This is a Saturnine conjunction, a constellation, an appearance, an influence. So we know where this story is going. It's going into ever more deep and dark realms. We see the tree spirits being murdered. We see that Tyrion and Jewel getting so angry and reckless that they themselves commit murder. They kill one of the Calamine soldiers. And as a result, they realise they've done something terribly wrong, and they give themselves up. And Tyrion the king is bound to a tree. And this, I think, is one of Lewis's most profound and subtle moments in the whole of the Narnia Chronicles, because in this scene, bound to a tree, cold, bleeding, alone and at night, Tyrion calls out in the darkness, Aslan, Aslan, come and save us, and nothing happens. The coldness and the darkness of the night go on as before. What does Tyrion do at that point? Does he give up? Does he admit that the Narnian universe is Saturnocentric? No, he's going through hell, and he keeps going. He cries out again, I ask nothing for myself, Tyrion says, let me be killed, but come and save all Narnia. In other words, he imitates the sacrifice of Aslan. He imitates the sacrifice of Christ, who gives up his very life for his people. It might be not obvious to us that this is the illusion that Lewis is making, because Tyrion, though he's bound to a tree, and we know that the tree is another name for the cross, because he's got his arms bound to his side like this, we don't see the cruciform allusion. But this is Tyrion's cry of dereliction. This is his moment of truth. And after he's given himself up, after he's sacrificed himself in principle for the sake of his kingdom, then, though the darkness of the night and the coldness of the night go on as before, he begins to feel somehow a little stronger. Somehow. We're not told how. It's very vague, it's very unclear what's beginning to strengthen him, but somehow he feels stronger for calling on Aslan. And although he doesn't know it, at that very moment, the children in England are seeing a vision of Tyrion, and they are beginning to hurry to his aid. His prayer is being answered, though he doesn't see it at once. But the animals come to his rescue, and again, in a lovely, subtle allusion to the cross of Christ, the animals climb up his body and give him a little drink of wine, and they dab his mouth with a sponge. So Saturn, although he had all these negative influences, had one good influence, according to Dante in the Divine Comedy, perhaps the greatest poem of the Middle Ages. Even as he heaped all these curses and terrible experiences upon you, Saturn would, if you responded correctly to his influence, make you into a true contemplative. So the sphere of Saturn in Dante's Divine Comedy is the heaven of contemplatives, those who see beyond superficial appearances of bleakness and darkness and penetrate with a kind of a wise, godly insight to the heart of spiritual reality. And indeed, we have seen that in Lewis's poem The Planets. Melancholy drink, for bane or blessing of bitter wisdom, Saturn pours for his people. There is a blessing to be had, even while these baneful experiences pour upon you. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed are those who die in the Lord. It's paradoxical. It goes against all our native instincts. But if we follow the path of Christ, we can find blessing even in these situations. So just very quickly to summarize the rest of the last battle. Jill and Eustace come to Tyrion's aid, which heartens him, strengthens him, gives him company, but doesn't by any means reverse the flow of the circumstances that they have to suffer. The Antichrist character, who at first seems to be just a donkey dressed up as a lion, puzzled in a lion skin, but later is shown to be related to, well, the ape and the cat and the Calamine forces, and finally is revealed to be actually a demon, Tash. This is the true anti-Christ, the true anti-Aslan, who is behind all these political machinations. It takes a while for the mask to slip, but eventually we see the true diabolical power behind all these other characters. But it's perplexing, and the good animals are puzzled. They don't know. I mean, it's interesting that the donkey itself is called Puzzle. There's no clarity. It's all confusion and darkness. We are on a darkling plain where ignorant armies clash by night. And eventually, Caer Paravel, the castle, is overthrown, is filled with dead Narnians. You can see some of the Narnians falling out of the window and lying here on the ground. And Runewit, the centaur, who had foretold all this, with the disastrous conjunctions prediction, Runewit, the centaur, is seen lying dead with an arrow in his side. And that's a very significant little detail, because if you know your signs of the zodiac, you will know that the centaur, Sagittarius, with his bow and arrow, is the sign of Jupiter. Is a jovial astrological sign. So the jovial image of the centaur bending his bow and arrow is now completely subverted. This is the anti-jovial situation, when the centaur has the arrow in his own side. Where is Jupiter? Who does not need to be reminded of Jove, but there's no joviality in this situation at all. Then we come to the final cataclysm, the very last battle, which is not going Tyrion's way, and indeed, it is just a prelude to the end of the world. Here comes a destructive tsunami, and here comes the moment of judgment for the whole of the Narnian cosmos. The characters all rush up to Aslan. Here's Aslan. And some of them look in his face with terror and dismay and disappear into his dark shadow. And some of them look into his face with love and recognition, and they come through into the heavenly Narnia. And Tyrion finds himself in the heavenly Narnia. He has been going through hell, and he has kept going, and as a result he emerges into the home of God, into the home of Aslan, and finds himself surrounded by the great kings and queens of Narnia's past. And it's not just Tyrion who is resurrected, but Runewit too. The centaur comes back to life and cries, "Further in and higher up," cried Runewit, and though they did not understand him, the words somehow set them tingling all over. Now that's a beautiful little play on words. Tingling, there's a double meaning in that, because the word tingle in Anglo-Saxon, in Old English, literally meant a star. We know this from one of Lewis's letters that he wrote to his father when he was learning Old English at Oxford. He said to his father, think of twinkle, twinkle, little star. Tingle, tingle, little star. That's the way you remember this. And almost every time that the word tingle or tingling appears in the Narnia Chronicles, it comes with this double meaning. So, for instance, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Lucy puts her hand on the book of spells written by the star character in the Dawn Treader, her hands tingle as if with electricity. That's because she's touching a work produced by the stars. So that's an indication that the true cosmological arrangement, the true order of the firmament has been re-established. Saturn has had his day, Saturn has done his worst, and some have responded to Saturn in the best possible way, Tyrion and Jewel and the others. And now, Jupiter, the king of the gods, the wisdom that dominates the stars, is back in charge. And we know this from a lovely little joke that occurs in this exchange. Isn't it wonderful, said Lucy. Have you noticed one can't feel afraid even if one wants to? Try it. By Jove, neither one can, said Eustace after he had tried. You might try to get back to Saturn, you might try to feel fear and darkness and despair, but by Jove, you cannot. By Jupiter, you cannot. Jupiter regains his happy seat, and although the last battle is dominated by Saturn, because they respond to Saturnine influence correctly by pushing through it and coming out the other side, there is a final jovial scene in the resurrection chapters of the last battle. Here is C.S. Lewis's gravestone. He died on the 22nd of November 1963, same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. And his brother was responsible for this tombstone, this gravestone, and Warren Hamilton Lewis, Lewis's brother, died 10 years later and joined him in the same plot. But it was Warren's decision to use this Shakespeare quotation, men must endure their going hence. The local rector of the parish said, you ought really to have a scriptural quotation. But Warren said, no, we're going to have this verse from King Lear. Men must endure their going hence even as their coming hither, is the full line in Shakespeare's King Lear. And Warren was insistent on having that on his brother's gravestone because it was that Shakespeare line that had appeared on their Shakespeare calendar, the family's Shakespeare calendar, on the day their mother had died. And Warren had remembered that all those decades, all those years. But I don't want to finish with this. I want to finish with the book that came out after Lewis's death, his book on prayer. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, was published a year after Lewis died. He finished it. It was in the presses. He'd done all the work on it, but it just came out a few months after he died. And this is a book which is a very ingenious book about prayer, because we only see one side of the correspondence. We only see Lewis's side of the correspondence. We don't see the letters back from Malcolm. Malcolm is an imaginary character for the sake of this exploration of prayer. But we don't see Malcolm's side of the correspondence. We hear various things about Malcolm. We hear that he's got a son, George, and a wife called Betty, and they're old friends, evidently, Lewis and Malcolm. And as the chapters progress, exploring different aspects of prayer, the relationship gets closer. We're told that actually Lewis is going to go and see Malcolm in person. Right? They're going to meet face to face. And it's interesting that the last letter is all about resurrection hope. But it's also a very practical discussion of how Lewis is going to visit Malcolm and Betty and where he's going to sleep when he gets there, because Lewis has been ill and he can't go up the stairs anymore. So this is the very end of Letters to Malcolm. And notice the very final word of this very last book of Lewis's. And recall how the planets are related to the days. This is what Lewis says. Then the new earth, he's talking about the resurrection life, the resurrection hope. Then the new earth and sky the same yet not the same as these, will rise in us as we have risen in Christ. And once again, after who knows what eons of the silence and the dark, the birds will sing out, and the waters flow, and lights and shadows move across the hills, and the faces of our friends laugh upon us with amazed recognition. Guesses, of course, only guesses. If they're not true, something better will be. For we know that we shall be made like him, for we shall see him as he is. Thank Betty for her note. I'll come by the later train, the 3:40, and tell her not to bother about a bed on the ground floor. I can manage the stairs again now, provided I take them in bottom gear. Till Saturday. Till the day of Saturn. Till the end of my life. Till Holy Saturday, which separates Good Friday from Easter Day. That's the moment of truth. That's when it will all become clear. That's when this distant relationship between Lewis and Malcolm will finally issue in a face-to-face reunion. Beautifully, beautifully subtle little nod to all of Lewis's interactions with the Saturnine spirit, which has occupied him throughout his life. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you. For a bit of Q&A, and Bill will come with a microphone to anybody who has a question. So let's start with this lady in the hat.